Hello, I'm Chris Bishop and welcome to this live CNBC Africa special ahead of what is likely to be an important week for one of the biggest industries in Africa. The mining Indaba, one of the largest industry gatherings on the planet, is set for Cape Town next week. It'll see more than 6,000 delegates make the journey to Cape Town to talk investment and the future of mining. Discussions and networking that could see the birth of many new mining projects. CNBC Africa will be covering the mining Indaba live from Cape Town every step of the way. Let's have a quick look at the numbers before we start this discussion to find out the reasons why mining matters. Now, South Africa is still one of the biggest mining nations on the continent, and this is its contribution to the product of the GDP of the country. Here we go. So 351 billion rand and 456,438 people. That's the 2018 figures. So, also it still employs a heck of a lot of people. Let's have a look at that, shall we, before we start the discussion. Okay, so there we are, 167,000 in platinum, 101,000 in gold, and coal comes behind at 86,000 over there. All right, and each commodity has its 92,000 people in coal there, 258 million tons produced in 2018, and but the net investment in the coal industry has declined by 10% since 2019. We'll be having a look at that later in the program. Diamonds still strong, as you can see, 7.2 million carats of diamonds. The total diamond sales in 2019, 13.3 billion rand. And gold is still king to a certain extent in this country. Sales increased 3.7% in 2019. Gold production decreased, though, 101.3 tons in 2019. And South African gold is still 4.2% of global gold production, and something like half of all the gold in the world has come out of this country. And platinum, finally, there, 80% of the world's supply comes out of the Bushveld complex just north of us here in Johannesburg, and also China is one of the biggest markets, accounting for 50% of the world's platinum jewellery offtake. Now, joining me for today's discussion a little bit later, hopefully we're going to have Dr. Petrus de Kok, General Manager for Research at Brand South Africa. But in the studio with me, I've got Tawanda Madondo, a Senior Coverage Banker, Natural Resources, ABSA Corporate Investment Banking, and Vikas Botha, the Energy and Natural Resources Leader for Africa at Ernst & Young. Thank you very much for joining me, gentlemen. Just looking at the Indaba in Cape Town next week, all of us will be there. I say over the last few years, it's been a bit gloomy at times. People have been thinking, what's your feeling about this year?
I think this year, just having spoken to a few senior executives in various companies, there's a renewed interest in the mining Indaba. I don't know whether it's off the back of your positive gold and PGM prices. It's always good, especially here in South Africa, since we are major producers of these minerals. I'm seeing a lot of them looking forward to going down this year, which I perhaps didn't see in the last 2-3 years.
Vikas, you've been going for many, many years. We both have. What do you think? I mean, last couple of times that you've been saying it's a bit gloomy. What do you think you're taking it this year?
Yeah, I think last year was certainly a bit of a turning point. Last year, optimism increased, and I'm sharing your sentiment that I think this year there's a lot of optimism. I think there's eagerness to get things done, and if I just judge by my own email inbox and the number of meetings that people would like to have and try and facilitate different kind of conversations across Africa, across all of the kind of contributors, whether it's government or investors or juniors, and everyone is very keen to chat and look for opportunity. So I think it's going to be a very good event this year.
And Gusto, looking at the industry overall here in South Africa, I mean, this year there's been a degree of stability, the regulations have been laid down, The government has been trying to reform the economy, and there's been quite a bit of industrial peace in relative to other years. I'm thinking back to 2014, that huge and damaging platinum strike that lasted for many, many months. How much on a better wicket do you think this year the industry is as it comes to the mining Indaba?
I think it's on a very good wicket. If you look at what happened previously, I think with the Marikana thing, which is very unfortunate, I think there are a lot of learnings out of that. I think you look at the recent gold and platinum wage negotiations. I think there's been a willingness from both parties, both the company as well as the trade unions, to find each other and to find each other very quickly. I think everybody understands the impact of not working, company loses profits, you don't get a salary. So I think that's been positive, and just going forward, given I think the tougher economic situations we're all in at the moment, we'll continue to find each other a lot quicker. But there will always be antagonism, between the two, because everybody obviously represents different constituencies.
So, Vikas, there was a little bit of concern when the Mining Charter 3 came out. It seemed, and also a lot of people have been talking about the royalties, which have also been priced in by the companies. How confident are you that maybe mining's turned the corner?
Yeah, I think it's been quite interesting how little we've seen in any of the media around regulations and Mining Charter 3 and even MPRDA. It's really quieted down. But I think it's a factor of probably because overall the mining industry has performed better than a couple of years ago. The pressures have been alleviated slightly, predominantly driven by overall strong commodity prices across most of the commodities. And I think so if you look at strong financial performance, it leads to relaxed wage negotiations, better tax collection and so forth, less stress on the banks. So when you see an environment where there's a little bit less stress, then you tend not to nitpick all the detail.
And talking about commodities, I mean, that's one of the things. There's been some star commodities in the last year, including palladium. I mean, it seems the world can't get enough of it to try and deal with this climate change driving cars. The price was up 19% of palladium, which is a byproduct of platinum, as we know, in 2020. Do you see this increase going on? I mean, prices at $2,500 an ounce at the moment.
I think all indications out there that it is going to be here for quite a bit of time. The reality is you can't open a new platinum mine in 1 year. That pretty much takes you 10 years basically to open one of those platinum mines in order to alleviate some of the supply constraints. So my view and our view in general is that prices will pretty much remain where they are. I think another contributing factor is this whole electrification thing, just around cars, and if China achieves in terms of electrification what it intends to do, the demand fundamentals for it are going to hold.
So we're going to talk about battery metals in a second, but I'll just finish this one about palladium. I mean, one of the concerns is that there's a squeeze on supply because there's not enough mines. As we just said, 10 years to get a new platinum mine. How likely is it that any investment could come through at this conference? People interested in putting in new mines, far-sighted people at that.
Yeah, so I mean, if you just look at the supply of platinum and palladium, so both Sibanye and Impala Platinum, they invested in North American projects. Both of those are predominantly palladium and less platinum because that ore body and geology is much more favored towards palladium. The same with Russia and the CIS, it's kind of nickel and palladium. Whereas in South Africa, the basket is slightly different. Lots of platinum and palladium almost in equal parts, and then it's a combination of all the other kind of metals that you mentioned, also with a strong component of chrome. And the one thing that I think you've got to commend all the platinum miners in South Africa is that they've done a pretty good job in moving away from a pure platinum play in terms of a more sort of value integrated, mining operation, but also benefiting from all of the commodities, and thereby de-risking kind of what they're doing. And I think that in my mind has been a great move. So with that as a platform, many other people are saying, hey, there's actually opportunity to do a sustainable, stable kind of mining, even when some of these commodities are bouncing around, like platinum being low, palladium being very high, but on balance we can actually have a pretty stable business. And I think that's encouraging for many other new entrants.
Now, as you were saying just now, I mean, the two words are going to be thrown around a lot at the Mining Indaba next week: battery metals. And again, there's all kinds of predictions with what's going on in China. You're saying, I mean, just give us an idea how you're reading it, the vastness of this electrification program that's going to change the demand for so-called battery metals.
I mean, if you look at, I think, the Davos, just the recent Davos conference which just happened, the whole world is on about the environment at the moment. So I do expect that to continue. I mean, it's going to become very topical in the coming years. I think the young people are saying to us older people now that, you must leave us a world which is going to continue for a long time. So from a demand perspective, in terms and growth perspective, in this whole battery minerals, I do expect that to continue. I think the primary benefit is of this. You look at lithium. Everyone talks lithium, but lithium is pretty much, I think the main resource in Africa pretty much sits in Zimbabwe. They have big deposits, but they haven't yet been fully explored. You look at cobalt on the other side. You're looking at DRC. So for them, we do see positive growth trends.
Because that's another thing I'm going to ask you, Vikas, here. Like investors, are they looking at it now thinking, well, maybe 10, 20 years' time, we're going to be really cashing in now and sinking their money into things like cobalt and copper, which, DRC and Zambia, there's big deposits. But again, it costs a lot of money and it's a lot of risk to go there and exploit them.
So I think energy storage, is here to stay. It's fundamentally shifted from on-demand energy towards preserving energy, linking with the ESG agenda and many of the other agendas. If you just think of, the key mega global trends. Firstly, mobility. Everyone is looking for mobility. People are looking for independence. And when you kind of do that with mobility and independence and and electrification where you need it, well, then it's pretty clear that energy storage is a key component. And so therefore, all the various shapes, whether it's batteries for your iPhone or whether it's big batteries for your house or even bigger batteries for your car or whatever that might be, the various shapes, whether it's a lithium-based one, whether it's cobalt predominant, whether it's there's so many of them, but all I think there's a place for them and it's here to stay. And even the big energy producers, the utilities, are also moving towards preserving energy because it's more predictable. You don't have to do it all the way just on demand. So I think from the individual consumer through to business, through to large generators and everything in between, are increasingly more dependent on energy storage as a source of reliable on-demand energy. So I think all of those commodities have got strong support into the future.
So I wonder, where do you think the money is likely to come from? I mean, who's got the cash at the moment, you think, for these kind of projects, long-term projects that are likely to soak up a lot of capital?
So I think, we're going to look towards the traditional places where it's come from. I think the Chinese, given, their objectives, they should be bringing a lot of cash in terms of to invest, especially in Africa for these. Also think, the developed world. And, us as banks will obviously play an integral role in that. So I think typically, what would happen is, well, they say that the equity holders fund up to feasibility study, and then us banks, will come and help them to fund their projects after that.
Because that's another thing that's being talked about, is this surge of junior miners, which may turn up this year for the first time for many years. We're talking about new projects. How do you see that? I mean, these are the commandos, if you like. These are the scouts for the mining industry. Get out there and grind away at projects for years before they sort of sell it over to the majors. Why do you think there's this surge of junior miners coming this year?
Yeah. Junior miners, they play an incredibly important role in, let's call it, in the whole extractive ecosystem. If you think about it, up front, those are predominantly the companies that do greenfield exploration and are looking around for opportunity, try and prove it up, and package it as something that they can sell to somebody with deeper pockets and more access to capital. So they play an important role in the continued sort of exploration and development of pipeline of projects. The majors are a lot more focused. Many of the businesses are very focused around optimizing and managing to the best of their ability a core portfolio rather than just everything. And so therefore they're allowing the juniors to play the front part of exploration and development and so forth. On the other hand though, they also play a very important role in the back end. So when the larger mining companies, and they've operated their mines until they believe it's optimal, then it gives a great opportunity for them to say, with our management style and the way in which we operate a portfolio, perhaps this mine is not suited for us anymore, but there's somebody with a lot more hands-on, a lot closer to the operations, who might really do some wonders with this asset, and therefore maybe it's time for us to pass it on. And then the juniors come again and doing sort of the back end of that. And so there's great opportunity. And of course, when you've got an overall environment of strong commodity prices, decent cash flow generation, and stability across stakeholders and regulations, I think it's a fantastic space for juniors to participate.
And a lot of the reasons why there has been this surge in interest from juniors is West Africa. You think, particularly in gold, it's opening up. There are a lot of opportunities there. What exactly is it that is driving this?
So, I mean, I think you have to go back in terms of to understand that Africa is a very large resource base from a minerals perspective. So West Africa is blessed to have such large reserves. Another factor is also just around the costs. West Africa is predominantly open pit mines, which are cheaper to run, less technical. And also in terms of from a labor perspective. So you have the flip side. So in South Africa, in terms of the cash costs, labor could be up to 50%. Whereas in West Africa, it's actually not a major part of the cost structure. So that's why the interest within that region, your ability to lock in high profit margins.
And also because, as I was saying here in this country, there's very deep, up to 4 kilometers down projects, very complicated projects in South Africa now. But in West Africa, it's a lot shallower, a lot easier, and a lot more attractive for investors.
Yeah, I think, globally, if we speak of sort of gold mining, it's being mined somewhere between 200 and 450 meters deep on a global scale. South Africa operates at 3 to 4 kilometers depth. So there's very few individuals and companies who really know and have the expertise to operate mines at this level of depth and technicalities like in South Africa. Whereas it's a little bit more homogeneous, it's more familiar than other territories, whether you're in South America, Australia, the North Americas. They're more familiar, which means there's a broader number of people who's interested in operating and mining those ore bodies.
And also, one of the things that we think will be a big one this year is this ESG investing, this so-called ethical investing in mining here. You think a lot of pension funds and the like will be coming here looking to find places where their money will be spent and no one will be harmed and it'll help the environment. Where do you think they'll be looking this year?
It's all around renewable energy. I think Africa is behind, I think our peers globally. Some of the large majors have come out with statements around, 100% renewable energy objectives. So I think they will be looking for us here on this continent in terms of how can they partner with us in order to get some of these projects off the ground. Because, like labor, it is quite a big cost component of the cost structure of these mines as well.
On the one hand, it sounds, because it's like 25% of costs, is it not? Yeah. Electricity. When the electricity crisis hit the mines here back in 2008, I remember a lot of people saying, well, it's not as easy as it looks trying to get your own electricity supply, because a mine still sucks quite a lot. How practical is it, though? Do you think that miners can set up their own PPAs and start making their own electricity?
Yes, I think there's let me call it, conceptually it's a fantastic idea. To execute it is slightly more complicated. And there's a couple of things. Take the current Eskom scenario in South Africa. Everyone is saying, please, can you sign off these agreements so that the renewable energy projects that's currently already been built and it's there, so that it can feed into the grid. That hasn't happened. So regulations, legislation, frameworks, that still needs to happen. On the same basis, if you then take it into your own sphere, in order for you to be able to produce that kind of electricity for yourself and the levels that you require at peak times, that's huge investments. And sometimes it can't be consumed by yourself. When you have an open pit operation that's less energy intensive than, say, these deep level mines, to that extent you can, because putting up renewable, whether it's solar or wind or the combination, putting that up and being able to do admin buildings and housing is one thing. Running shafts and headgear and smelting plants, that's a completely different energy profile. And so therefore, I don't think it's as binary as it's the one or the other. It's got to be both and maybe something else. And that then takes us to the coal discussion, and quite often there's an emotional discussion around coal. But is coal all bad, or is it something that needs to be considered over time? Because take South Africa, we won't be able to just switch off because energy supply is incredibly important. So maybe there's something about responsible coal mining, fixing and upgrading power generation towards better quality and cleaner coal, as opposed to just putting coal aside. So I think it's got to be finding that balance between all the different sources of energy that you can find and showing progress towards being conscious around what we want to achieve, rather than the one or the other.
Now we're going to be talking a lot more about the coal conundrum when we open the second half in a few minutes. But this thing about ethical, surely mining in South Africa has had a lot of problems with safety. It's had a lot of problems with labour problems in the past, energy problems. How difficult is it, do you think, it's going to be to sell it to ethical investors who want their investments to be squeaky clean?
So I think South Africa, just if you look at in terms of the various laws and regulations which people have to comply with, is already quite far ahead in terms of where people ideally think we are in terms of complying with these regulations. You look at safety. All the mines have a zero harm policy. I was looking at the stats last night in terms from the mining charter. You find that from 1993, there were 651 deaths. Now we're at 53 deaths. So it's still high, but we're going there to get to a zero. From that perspective, I think, from a compliance perspective, I think there's still a lot to be done. But I think we'll definitely, ahead, and we'll get there first.
Okay, we'll hold that thought there. We're going to a quick break now. Unfortunately, Dr. Petrus de Kock, General Manager for Research at Brand South Africa, won't be able to join us, but in the second half, we will be with Tawanda Madondo, the Senior Coverage Banker, Natural Resources at ABSA, Corporate Investment Banking, and also with Vikas Botha, the Energy and Natural Resources Leader for Africa at Ernst & Young. Do stay with us. This is a CNBC Africa special on the mining Indaba. It's coming up next week in Cape Town. Do stay with us for the second half. Welcome back to this CNBC Africa Live special. I'm Chris Bishop. We're looking ahead to the mining Indaba in Cape Town next week. It's going to be quite an interesting week by the looks of it. There's going to be a lot of talk about investment. There's going to be a lot of mining companies there looking for business. And we'll all be there with my guests here, Tawanda Madondo, the Senior Coverage Banker, Natural Resources, ABSA Corporate Investment Banking, and Vikas Porter, Energy and Natural Resources Leader for Africa at EY. Okay, gentlemen, starting with you, Tawanda. Before the break, we mentioned coal, which I think is a huge topic here. I mean, the question is, how is coal going to fare, you think, in the investment stakes going forward? Bearing in mind, a lot of banks around the world, and even one in this country, is saying they're not going to back coal projects anymore because of climate change, because of the restrictions on the environment. How do you think it's going to fare?
I think coal is really at a watershed. I think the main challenge is really around the environmental issues. But I think, South Africa, is endowed with all these coal reserves, right? And it's an integral part of our energy supply. So, in the medium term, we're still going to be reliant on coal, and that's going to have to be managed to that point whereby we can get alternative, cheaper sources of energy.
But I'm sorry, because I hate to sound sort of cynical as a journalist, but I mean, every time I hear politicians say, oh, we're going to be completely renewable in 10, 20 years, I think this is an economy with all the lights shining on us now. We're like 70% on coal-fired power stations, and it looks like there's very little sign that they're going to be phased out. The country can't afford it. What do you think the future is?
Well, I think if you're looking for a statement from me, it won't happen. So sorry about all the politicians.
You should never be in politics, but carry on there. Okay.
But I mentioned it earlier, and I just don't think that this kind of binary discussion around it just makes sense. I don't think it's helpful. What's important, though, is we all know that our energy source, we are hugely dependent on coal at the moment. Now, that does not mean that we need to be on coal. We don't need to be coal dependent forever. So globally, there's a coal substitution strategy and a trend, and it has to happen here equally. So I think what's important is we've got to recognize that cleaner energy is important, and therefore some level of substitution will need to happen. But it also doesn't mean that it's just, get rid of coal and replace it with something else. There's lots of technology that allows for higher grade, cleaner coal to be used, which significantly reduces, emissions and carbon footprints and so forth. But you also supplement that with many things, I know in South Africa, nuclear is a swear word at the moment for various reasons, but there is a place in the world and in energy mix for nuclear energy as well, just like there's a place for renewable energy and all the various sources, whether it's harvesting tides or whether it's wind or solar. For all of them, there's a place. And I think that's the important thing, is to ensure that we will look at all of the options. So typically, it is true that there is a challenge for most coal miners to find funding easily because of certain views around many of the organizations funding them. But that means that it will help to diversify energy and it will help to move it towards a certain goal. But I don't think it's going to just be switched off in the next 5 years or 10 years or so. We'll, around Mpumalanga, that we are going to see some coal-fired power stations in a number of years.
But I mean, just without being too cryptic here, but basically, you look at the palaver that the private independent power producers went through to create a tiny smidgen for the national grid. They worked for years, they developed these projects, they went through the entire process, and at the end, they ended up waiting 2-3 years for their money. There were lots of questions over how much they should pay. I mean, if I was looking to invest in renewable energy, I'd look at that story and I think, well, maybe I should think of investing elsewhere. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's a process, right? I don't think things don't happen overnight. So I think that whole round which we went through all the delays, you'll find that moving forward, and I think government is supportive that all those processes will happen a lot quicker. I mean, at the end of the day, it was our first time doing it. And I think there are learnings from that to help us to move forward quicker.
Because it's going to take a hell of a lot of investment and a hell of a lot of courage from people to put money up for long term. I mean, bearing in mind that it's not like a big one of these bulk coal-fired power stations where you can rely on 4,500 megawatts. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of land and a lot of risk.
No, you're right. You're right. But at the end of the day, I mean, like you look at it, South Africa is blessed with a lot of sunshine. We have a lot of land. So, you know, my whole attitude to that is, you know, if certain fundamentals are there, why not?
Well, moving away from steam coal to export coal now, this country exports a lot of its best coal overseas. What about the demand? How do you see it coming from India, particularly with their coastal power stations that have been set up, and also China as well, bearing in mind we're talking about electrification process in South African coal?
Now, I think the higher grade energy coal that we commonly refer to as the export grade coals, you know, the market fundamentals for it is still strong, and I think it will continue. But, you know, the exact same conundrum we've got in South Africa is everywhere else in the world. So finding the right mix of energy, what it's being used for energy generation primarily, you know, that is evolving. You know, you look at Europe, there's been a big shift towards moving away from coal-fired power stations toward a combination of renewables and nuclear and so forth. And you're likely to see it all over, but it's not going to happen overnight. So I think, you know, the market fundamentals certainly in the short and the medium term for, you know, India, maybe many of the other subcontinent countries, the Asian countries, it's still there, and I think it will continue being there for at least you know, the medium term. And then as that progresses, we'll probably see shift in investment strategy, maybe towards higher grade, more concentrated kind of coal that burns cleaner with higher, you know, CV counts and so forth. And that will then be substituted or supplemented, I would imagine, because also the population keeps on growing. So it's not like we're consuming less and less and less energy every single year. So it's probably a supplementing rather than substitution with other sources of energy.
And also another interesting story of the last decade is where European Union, from being the biggest customer for export coal from South Africa, has almost dropped off the map. I was thinking how quickly these things can change. But particularly India, there was a time when I was writing stories about how India was looking to come in and actually buy up coal mines here and secure supply for their many coal-fired power stations. Do you see that gaining any momentum?
I think it actually has gained momentum. I mean, you look at it around 2012, I think coal going to India was around 20-something million tons. Last year, we're talking about 82 million tons went through to India. So there is a lot of interest from India in terms of what Vicar said. And I think they're probably now going to be looking to make more meaningful investments.
And just one last thing on coal before we move on, Vickers. I mean, the experts were complaining 10 years ago there weren't enough mines being sunk to feed the power stations we've got. What signs are you seeing that there is going to be a squeeze on supply?
Well, I guess starting close to home, I mean, it's quite evident. You can see that. Just if you think of the two newest power stations being built, the big ones, Medupi and Kusile, you know, there's already challenges in terms of securing that supply from a long term, and it's for various reasons. So absolutely, and particularly if you're going to be looking to upgrade the quality of the coal, there are some challenges because the overall quality mix of what's being mined at the moment in South Africa and in some other places, there is some challenges. I did want to mention one thing. You know, you mentioned around sort of, you know, Europe as a coal customer and how that has changed. Just bearing in mind that, you know, European energy is not carbon free. It's just a different kind of carbon because, you know, they get majority of their energy via gas, and gas is also just a carbon and just in a different shape and form.
No, sure. It's interesting how quickly things change in the resources business. But moving on now to the people who actually gather those resources in the mines here. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about mechanization going on. In fact, not too long back, I was speaking to Nick Holland at Goldfields, and he said that they were pushing ahead with it, and he was saying that people didn't want anymore to be underground with a drill standing there in the heat for hours and hours and hours. But how much is this part of this zero harm that everyone talks about? Because that's one of the great sort of difficult stories of mining in South Africa, and the fact that a lot of people have given their lives, sadly, underground in the mining industry. Do you think the mechanization is moving to a point where the human factor could be taken out of it?
I think it is, and in terms of what's happened out there, I mean, in terms of, there are quite a lot of open pit mines, whereby people are beginning to use drones, maybe to check that it's all clear to blast. After the blast, what is the situation? To look at things around transport within the pit, to make sure there are no accidents. And I think it's imperative for us here in South Africa, given how deep our mines are, to deploy a lot of resources in terms of trying to get ahead of the curve, because I think one life is one too many, and I think, as I said earlier, your millennials now are concerned that this is whatever, if it's a diamond, no one died getting this diamond. Those things are important to them, and they should be to all of us as well. So I think we are being forced to mechanize.
And that's one thing, because we were talking about before the program, is that say the mines in South Africa had a lot of stick over their safety records. Yeah. I mean, there was a time when a few hundred people a year were dying in the mines, but actually, if you've been down a mine, which we all have, the safety strictures you have to go through to get down there, it's not just casual. There's a lot of stuff that's done, actually. What more do you think can be done?
Yeah, certainly. I think, everyone that I've ever met in a mining environment, takes it incredibly serious. I don't think I've ever met somebody who's cavalier around these kind of things. It's a very, very important topic for them. But linking, say, safety to culture and behavior, and then you're linking it to, we're talking about technology. So I think mining has moved beyond automation and technology, and mechanization. I think it's actually around bringing it all together. It's no longer just about having equipment or technology or automating it. It's the digital agenda, supplementing it with AI, bringing that all back to say, well, I am now able to put better information in people's hands, either to be predictive or to raise alarm bells earlier, or when something happens allows me to respond in a better way or faster, and that's what it's about. And in my mind, I can clearly see how with that knowledge at fingertips that people are able to have today, that we didn't have a bunch of years ago, is fundamentally changing the way in which people work. You speak about nobody wants to operate rock drills like that anymore. But it's real. It's happening today that you have remote operated rock drills, even underground. You have it. And people are sitting in remote operating centers where there's a few hundred people based there, and they are having technology enabled jobs just like any one of us would do, or our kids play computer games. That's what they do, because that is something that they aspire to. If we're looking to attract new talent, and we're looking to attract people, by offering only the sledgehammer and a pick and a shovel and those things, we will not attract next generation of people. So I don't think technology is there to achieve one goal. It's there. It's actually to stay relevant. And so therefore we can see it coming, but I also believe that all of the technology advancements incrementally will support the safety agenda and the broader ESG agenda as well.
But I wonder, how many kids in Africa, though, you think actually go to bed at night dreaming of being mining engineers? I don't know. I mean, I met at one of the previous mining Indaba, was a 19-year-old young guy, very bright, very smart, and he said his dream was to be a mining engineer. He was doing a year's work experience, one of the big ones. But I looked him up recently, 6 years later, and he went through his training, he went to college, he did mining engineering, but I don't think he's actually doing it. I mean, what is it you think the youngsters today, they don't want to go underground and get dust all over them? I don't know. What do you think?
Maybe I'll relate with a personal story.
Okay.
I grew up in a mining town. Yes, I didn't dream of becoming a mining engineer, but here I am. I work within the mining industry. But when you look at it, right? So in terms of the community which these mines impact, I do think there is still a lot of interest, because I mean sometimes it's that circle of influence around you which informs you in terms of what you do. So it actually now speaks to, let's say, the broader South African environment. Like, so you look at it in terms of the BE codes, like in terms of as you grow up and you're seeing there's more black faces around, engineers and all that. That creates a ripple effect which begins to inspire the next generation of people to get that interest.
But how much of that is there a skills gap here in the mining industry? I mean, I remember at the time of writing that story about that young fellow at the mining in Indaba, I think the information I got then, there was only 500 mining engineers left in the entire mines of South Africa, which is like nothing, really. And people are always complaining there's a shortage of mining engineers and artisans and all that stuff. I mean, I don't know what the industry can do about it sometimes. It's not that they're not interested or they aren't spending money on it. What is the problem?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a South African problem or an African problem. It's a global problem. And when I speak to my colleagues and clients and so forth around this topic, even in Australia and Canada, they got the same challenge. Attracting future talent to a industry that's often considered to be dirty, or it's unsexy, or it's difficult to attract people to that. But that's where I think the shift comes in. And if you just think about all the global themes around mobility and independence and therefore what's globally referred to as future of work, but all of those themes really plays to, well, how do you bring people back to an industry and make it interesting? Well, that's creating different jobs. So maybe the relevance of a specific mining engineer or so, maybe that's not that relevant anymore. But the role of a chemical engineer, of a mechanical engineer, of a software engineer, that's becoming increasingly more important. So I think it's about recognizing the importance of creating an environment, if I can call it an ecosystem, but creating this ecosystem where people with different backgrounds and different aspirations, where they all feel there's something for me to contribute. Because the bottom line is, and there's this age-old saying, they say everything we consume, it's either farmed or mined. So you're never going to farm gold or diamonds or iron ore, and it's always going to be needed. So the reality is, mining is desperately needed for the world to prosper and for the world to move forward. The way in which we go about it, I think there's perhaps a little bit of effort required from the broader industry to sell that story.
How do you sell that story? I mean, Tawanda, you grew up in a mining town, right? A, what attracted you to mining ultimately in your career? I mean, with your experience there. And B, how would you sell it to a youngster who knows nothing about mining, who didn't grow up in a mining town? But just the first part of the question, what attracted you growing up to mining?
For me, to be honest, it was the lifestyle, right? Living on a mining town. We just found the lifestyle quite pleasant. I think, people think it's isolated, but in terms of what you have access to on a mine, and sometimes in an urban city, is chalk and cheese. Yeah. But in terms of how I would sell it, more importantly to somebody wanting to get into the industry, it's really the magnitude of the industry. I mean, sometimes like you don't see what's underground, you just see some headgear and that. So I think it's through programs whereby you take some of the kids underground, you show them what's happening, because through that you actually then get a realistic feel of what's the shaft look like, and just show you maybe how insignificant you are, and also allows you to see, you know, from a physics perspective, what you need to do in order to design these things. That's how I would sell it, just through bringing people closer into the industry.
And just lastly, before we move on from this subject, because I was going to say, I mean, I've been 4 kilometres underground, same as you, and not to work, but just to visit. And it's not what one might call comfortable underground. I mean, how could you sell it to the youngsters, you think?
Yeah, look, I mean, I get the challenge. The interesting thing is, if you think about kind of the industry that I work in, whenever we've got newbies that join the organization, the first thing they say is, I want to go into financial services, I want to focus on the financial services group, you know, as an industry in our organization. Not many say, hey, I want to go into energy or mining and so forth. But you know, the interesting part is we've got close to 600 people dedicated to the energy industry at EY across the business. And what's fascinating is that it only takes one to say, this is not about shoveling rocks. Actually, this is about big data analysis. This is about large volumes of data. This is about actually solving complex problems, not necessarily by working harder and sweating more, but actually about strategically thinking about how do I sequence activities to be able to solve a problem. And that's the thing that, you know, mining has really moved away. It's from only, let me call it, the heavy lifting, sort of dirty part of the game. By far the minority of people today actually work in that part of the mining cycle. Most of it is actually in very different components and very different parts. It's around planning and strategy and execution and looking for better ways to do things. And that's quite interesting. So the moment that you say to somebody, before you judge, give it a go. We hardly ever find anyone that joins the team and says, actually, I think I've had enough, I'm looking for something else. So my suggestion is, just say to anyone, say, before you say nay, just give it a go.
Okay. Anyway, looking ahead to next week now, what do you think are going to be the main issues coming out when investors start sitting down with mining houses there? Again, you've got to admit that the industry and the economy have taken a bit of a battering over the last decade or so. How do you think Africa can sell itself?
Well, I think from an African perspective, I think it's just re-emphasizing that, we do have a large untapped resource base, that there are gems out there still to be discovered and found. There's been a huge move in terms of, so when you look at the risk-reward matrix, there's been a huge move in Africa in that, we are closing the gaps to some of the other regions like Latin America. That's been on the back of some positive regulatory amendments to various legislations in various countries. When you look at it, I think at one stage South Africa used to be considered the best, but now it's Ghana, and you're seeing like a lot of West African countries, like putting in policies to attract investment.
Because that's another thing, and the fact that there's so much more competition now, not just from there, from everywhere, from Chile to the States to whatever for mining now. How should South Africa be dealing with that kind of competition?
Yeah, so I think just across Africa, in general, most of the jurisdictions have done a reasonable job to create an environment conducive to investment, a little bit more stable. There's not many instances today where we hear all sorts of stories around, policy debates. Yes, they're there and they need to be solved. And in South Africa, we've got our own discussions, but it's actually quieted down slightly. So you take a country like Nigeria as an example, which I think is a good example, very focused on the oil and gas industry for many years. And when they've encountered some challenges, what they realized was that structurally the economy wasn't diversified. And so they're on a big drive, and I think there's a Nigerian ministerial delegation coming to Indaba as well, with a big focus of saying, come have a look. We got some pretty good investment opportunities and a good endowment. However, we do realize that there's still work to be done around the geology to prove that it's economically mineable. So I think, you know, there's many jurisdictions recognizing that. South Africa is substantially far advanced in that we've got incredibly good data around geology, so we know what's going on there. So for South Africa's investment case, it's not necessarily around policy, because I think the policies are actually quite good. I would like to see, though, some further development around policy to enable better use of technology, AI, innovation, and so forth, because I think there are some challenges. But it's not about that. The key challenge for South Africa is ensuring that our capacity for infrastructure can really serve the purpose of what mining companies and investments want to achieve. You know, we hear this often, but I do think that Eskom is a key ingredient in the investment decision-making process, because that is an important aspect. But it's not just Eskom; it's ensuring that all of our, you know, capacity, whether that's rail and freight or energy and water and so forth, all of that, I think that is an important aspect and a key consideration in terms of making investment decisions.
So I wonder, how do you think South Africa could sort of freshen up and polish up its policy to catch the eye of foreign investors?
So I think the immediate thing would be, you know, maybe give them more favorable tax breaks to encourage people to come in. I think it's, you know, at the same time somebody would say, but, you know, the fiscus needs money. But I think, you know, to fully take advantage of what we have, we need to incentivize people to come here.
Yeah.
So next week, last comment from you both. What are you hoping for at the Mining Indaba?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of people there, and I'm really looking forward to, you know, to having all the conversations. I think what I'd be keen on seeing is perhaps a little bit of collaboration beyond the, you know, traditional spheres. We know there's a lot of interest from OEMs, because they now taking direct investment in the cycle, because that's the way they can also secure supply. So it's going to be very interesting to see the dynamics between the investors and the mining companies, and hopefully, you know, we can play a part in facilitating all of that.
And last quick word from you, Tawanda?
Commitment to investments.
Well, there you are on those words. I'll see you both there in Cape Town next week. Thank you very much indeed to Tawanda Madondo, the Senior Coverage Banker Natural Resources at ABSA Corporate Investment Banking, and also Vikas Porter, the Energy and Natural Resources Leader for Africa at EY. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this CNBC Africa Mining Indaba special, going out live across the continent. We'll be covering the Mining Indaba from Cape Town. I'll be there next week. We're covering every step of the way. Do stay tuned if you want to keep in touch with mining. From me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.